They thought it was over. That is the detail most people miss when they read the story of the crucifixion and resurrection. Not the theology, not the doctrine, the human experience of those 3 days, the texture of the silence, the weight of the defeat, the smell of blood still fresh on stone pavement, the sound of a city moving on as if nothing had happened. Because for most people in Jerusalem that weekend, nothing had happened. A man had been executed. It was not unusual. The Romans crucified people along public roads as a message, as a warning, as a demonstration of what happened to those who disturbed the order of empire. Crosses were not symbols of hope in the 1st century. They were instruments of maximum humiliation. To die on a cross meant you had been stripped of everything: your clothing, your dignity, your name, your future. And so when the disciples scattered on Friday evening, they were not simply grieving. They were surviving. To be associated with a crucified man was dangerous. It marked you. It made you visible to the wrong people. The world of 1st century Judea was small in ways that are difficult to imagine from a modern distance. Jerusalem during Passover swelled to perhaps 200,000 people. Pilgrims flooding in from across the Roman world, sleeping in courtyards, on rooftops, in tents pressed against the city walls. The streets were narrow, loud, and layered with the smells of animals, bread, burning oil, and the dust of thousands of sandaled feet. But underneath that temporary density was a permanent social web, a world where everyone knew who you belonged to, which village you came from, which rabbi you followed, and what it meant that your teacher had just been executed as a criminal and a rebel. Reputation in that world was not an abstraction. It was survival. It determined whether a merchant would extend you credit, whether a family would agree to a marriage contract, whether neighbors would help you harvest before the rain came. To lose your reputation was to lose your footing in the material world. This is why the disciples were behind locked doors. John's Gospel is precise about this detail. The doors were locked for fear of the Jewish authorities. This was not metaphorical fear. It was the calculated fear of people who understood exactly how the machinery of power worked in occupied Judea, and who knew that the same system that had killed Jesus could reach them just as easily. If you have been walking with us through these reconstructions of the biblical world, the hidden textures of daily life in 1st century Judea, consider staying close. Subscribe to the channel because this kind of history changes the way you read the Gospels, and there is much more to uncover together. Now, let us stay with those locked doors for a moment, because they tell us something essential. The house where the disciples gathered was almost certainly in the lower city of Jerusalem, a dense neighborhood of stone buildings stacked close together, with shared walls, interior courtyards, and flat rooftops where families slept in summer. The doors of such houses were heavy, made of wood reinforced with iron, and they were barred from the inside with a thick wooden beam dropped into iron brackets fixed to the wall. To lock a door in that world was a deliberate act, requiring physical effort, communicating clearly to anyone inside, "We do not want to be found." Saturday passed in that silence. The Sabbath rules meant the city was quieter than usual. No commerce, no travel beyond a certain distance, no labor. The streets that had been packed with Passover pilgrims were now stilled by the requirements of the law. For the disciples, this stillness was not peace. It was suspension. The terrible pause between catastrophe and consequence, when the mind runs forward to every possible outcome and finds none of them bearable. They had left everything to follow this man. Fishermen had abandoned boats and nets. A tax collector had walked away from a profitable and hated profession. Women had traveled with the group at considerable social cost, financing the movement from their own resources. 3 years of shared meals, shared roads, shared conversations at the edge of campfires in the Galilean hills. 3 years of watching him touch lepers, argue with Pharisees, weep at a tomb, feed thousands on a hillside with bread they could not explain. And now he was in a sealed tomb in a garden outside the city walls. The tomb itself was a specific kind of structure, a coke tomb carved horizontally into the soft limestone of the hillside, with a low entrance sealed by a rolling stone that sat in a carved channel. The stone was not lifted, but rolled, and it was heavy enough that the Gospels note the women on their way to the tomb were asking each other who would roll it away for them. This was not a small concern. These stones could weigh more than a ton. They were designed precisely so that animals and grave robbers could not easily enter. Once sealed, a tomb communicated finality in the most physical, material language possible. He was inside. The stone was in place. The guard had been posted, according to Matthew's account, at the request of the chief priests, who remembered Jesus had spoken of rising after 3 days and wanted no possibility of the disciples stealing the body and manufacturing a resurrection story. They were afraid of the story. Even before it happened, the authorities were afraid of what the story could become. That fear is its own kind of testimony. Sunday came before the sun. In the world of first-century Judea, the day did not begin with an alarm or a gradual awakening into light. It began in absolute darkness, in the hour before dawn when the air was coldest and the city had not yet stirred. The women who went to the tomb that morning, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and others depending on which gospel account you follow. They moved through streets that were still dark, carrying spices they had prepared before the Sabbath rest had interrupted everything. The spices matter. They are not a decorative detail. In a world without embalming, without refrigeration, without the modern technologies of preservation that make death manageable at a sanitary distance, the body of a person you loved began to change almost immediately after death. The spices, a mixture of myrrh, aloe, and aromatic resins, were applied not only as an act of honor, but as an act of love that worked against the physical reality of decay. To anoint a body was to say, "You mattered enough for us to be here, in the dark, carrying heavy jars, doing what needed to be done, even when it costs us something." These women had been present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled. They had watched where the body was laid. And now, on the first day of the week, they were moving toward the tomb while the city still slept, doing the work of grief with their hands. What they found when they arrived has been the center of Christian proclamation for 2,000 years. But it is worth slowing down and staying inside the human experience of that moment, rather than rushing to the theological conclusion. The stone was already moved, not cracked, not partially displaced, rolled away, completely, from the entrance. The seal was broken. The guard, according to Matthew, had fled. The tomb was open in the gray half-light of early morning, and the opening was low. You had to bend down to enter, which is precisely what John records when he describes Peter and the beloved disciple running to the tomb and the beloved disciple stooping to look inside before entering. That stooping posture is specific. It is the posture of someone approaching something uncertain, something that might require them to reorganize everything they believe about what is possible. Inside, the burial cloths were there. This is one of the most quietly remarkable details in the resurrection accounts. The linen wrappings that had been wound around the body were present, not thrown aside in the chaos of an escape or a theft, but lying there, in place, with the cloth that had covered the face rolled up separately. John notes that when the beloved disciple saw this arrangement, he saw and believed. Something about the specific order of what was left behind told him that this was not the work of grave robbers, not the work of the Roman guard, not the work of the chief priests, not the work of frightened disciples in the night. Grave robbers in first-century Judea were a known problem. Wealthy families went to considerable lengths to protect their tombs precisely because thieves would steal burial goods. The fine linen, the clay vessels, the jewelry sometimes buried with the dead. A thief in a hurry does not fold anything. A thief does not arrange the face cloth separately and leave it behind. The linen wrappings themselves had value. To leave them in careful order inside an empty tomb was, in the language of that world, to leave a message. Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb and wept. Again, stay with this for a moment. She had not yet encountered anything that explained the empty tomb. She had arrived in the dark, found the stone moved, seen the empty cloths, and now stood in the garden in the growing light of morning, weeping. She had already run once to tell Peter and the others what she found, and had returned. She was not running anymore. She was standing still in her grief, which is what grief eventually forces you to do when there is nowhere left to go. John's account of what happens next is written with the restraint of someone who knows that the most important moments in human experience do not announce themselves loudly. Jesus appears. Mary does not recognize him at first. She assumes he is the gardener. This assumption is not strange. In the morning light, in her grief, in the cognitive impossibility of what was actually happening, she would have had no framework for recognizing a man she had watched die 3 days earlier. The category did not exist. Dead men did not return in bodily form in first-century Jewish expectation. The resurrection of the dead was a future event, a collective event at the end of the age, not something that happened to one person, alone, in a garden, on a Sunday morning. When he says her name, she recognizes him. This, too, is specific in ways that the modern reader can miss. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks about his relationship with his followers in terms of a shepherd and his flock. And the defining characteristic of that relationship is the voice. The sheep know the shepherd's voice. They follow it. They do not follow a stranger's voice because they do not know it. When Jesus says Mary's name in the garden, something more than a sound passes between them. It is the recognition of a voice that she had heard for 3 years. A voice that had spoken over storms and over tombs and over the broken lives of people no one else would look at. She turns, she says, Rabboni, my teacher, not Lord, not God, teacher. The word of someone who is still processing what is in front of her, reaching for the most familiar category available, and finding it inadequate but using it anyway, because it is the closest thing she has to the truth of what she is experiencing. The city behind them was beginning to wake. Smoke from cooking fires, the sound of animals, the first voices of the day rising from the dense stone neighborhoods of Jerusalem. Life was resuming its ordinary rhythms in the ordinary world. And here, in a garden outside the walls, everything had already changed, though almost no one yet knew it. The news moved the way all news moved in that world. On foot, through narrow streets, carried in the breath of people who could not contain what they had seen. There was no mechanism in first-century Jerusalem for broadcasting information. No written proclamations nailed to walls, no town criers hired for this purpose, no network of messengers on fast horses riding toward distant cities. Information traveled through the social fabric itself, through the relationships between people who trusted each other, through the chains of community that connected households and synagogues and marketplaces, and the open roads between villages. If you wanted to tell someone something, you went to them, or you sent someone you trusted, and the message arrived with the weight and credibility of the person who carried it. This is why the resurrection accounts are populated with specific names and specific locations. The Gospel writers were not decorating their narratives with incidental detail. They were providing the ancient equivalent of verifiable testimony, naming the witnesses, identifying the places, establishing the chain of transmission that allowed someone hearing the story in Corinth or Antioch or Rome to trace it back to its source. Mary Magdalene carried the news first, then other women, then Peter, running, then the beloved disciple, then the report to the gathered community, then the road to Emmaus, 7 miles west of Jerusalem, where 2 disciples were walking in the middle of that same day, leaving the city in defeat, and a stranger joined them on the road and began asking questions. The Emmaus account in Luke's Gospel is one of the most human passages in the entire New Testament, and it is worth inhabiting it fully because it captures something precise about how the human mind encounters the impossible. The 2 disciples on the road, one named Cleopas, the other unnamed, were processing what had happened in the way that people in grief process catastrophe, by talking. They were going over it, reconstructing it, trying to find the shape of something that made sense. They had hoped, they told the stranger, that Jesus was the one who would redeem Israel. The past tense is everything. They had hoped. The crucifixion had moved that hope into the past tense, into the category of things that were once believed and are no longer possible. What they did not know, what the Gospel account makes clear with quiet precision, is that they were telling the story to the person the story was about. The stranger walks with them. He listens to them describe his own death. And then he begins, from the beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures, to explain to them how all of it had been pointing toward exactly what had happened. Luke says that as he spoke, their hearts burned within them, a phrase that deserves attention. Not their minds, not their theological understanding, their hearts. Something below the level of argument and analysis was being reached, some recognition that ran deeper than logic and arrived before the mind caught up. They reached Emmaus as the day was ending. The first-century Jewish understanding of hospitality meant that you did not allow a traveler to continue into the night without offering shelter and food. To do so would have been a violation of the deep social obligations that structured life in that world. So they urged him to stay, constrained him, Luke says, with the word that implies active insistence, not polite suggestion. And he agreed. The meal they sat down to was ordinary in every material sense. Bread, almost certainly. Perhaps olives, dried fish, whatever was available in the house they had entered. The table would have been low, the diners reclining on mats or cushions in the posture of first-century dining, the oil lamp casting unsteady light across their faces and the simple objects on the surface between them. He took the bread. He gave thanks. He broke it, and they recognized him. This gesture, taking bread, blessing it, breaking it, distributing it, was something Jesus had done in their presence before. At the Last Supper, 3 days earlier, he had performed this same sequence of actions and attached to it language they were still trying to understand. But more than that, this was a gesture he had performed on a hillside in Galilee, when 5,000 people sat on the grass and watched him do the same thing and found themselves fed in a way that made no material sense. The gesture carried memory. It carried identity. It was his, specific to him in the way that a person's particular way of doing an ordinary thing becomes, over time, a kind of signature that the people who love them learn to read. The moment of recognition and the moment of his disappearance were simultaneous. He was known to them in the breaking of the bread, and then he was no longer there. What happened next tells us something important about how these early witnesses understood what they had experienced. They did not sit with the wonder of it. They did not wait until morning. They got up immediately in the dark and walked the 7 miles back to Jerusalem. 7 miles on foot in the night on roads that were not safe. The Roman road system connected major cities, but the paths between smaller settlements were unpaved, unlit, and traveled at night only by people with urgent reason. They had urgent reason. When they arrived back in Jerusalem and found the gathered disciples, they discovered that something had already happened to Peter as well. The risen Jesus had appeared to him, though the Gospels record this fact without giving us the details of that encounter, as if the privacy of it belongs to Peter alone, and to whatever passed between them after the denial in the courtyard of the high priest. And then, while they were all still speaking, he was there. Luke's account says he stood in the middle of them. John specifies that the doors were still locked. He did not enter through a door that had been opened. He was simply present among them, in the room, in a body that was genuinely his. They could see the wounds in his hands and his side. And yet a body that no longer operated under the constraints that every other body they had ever known was subject to. They were terrified. This response is almost always softened in popular imagination, where the resurrection appearances tend to be depicted as moments of warm reunion and immediate joy. But the text is honest about what the first response actually was: terror. The word Luke uses is the word for being startled by something that violates the known categories of reality. These were not people who had been waiting in confident expectation. They were people who had been hiding in grief and fear, and suddenly the person they had watched die was standing among them, and their minds had no container for it. He showed them his hands and his feet. He asked for something to eat, and they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it in front of them. This detail, the broiled fish, is one of the most grounded and particular details in the resurrection accounts. It is not the detail of a legend that has been smoothed into grandeur over time. It is the specific, slightly awkward, entirely human detail of a moment that no one present could have invented, because invention tends toward the magnificent, and this is simply real. He ate the fish. They watched him. And slowly, the terror began to move toward something else. What do you do with something that has no precedent? This was the actual problem facing the small community of disciples in the days and weeks after that Sunday morning. Not the theological problem, that would come later, worked out over decades of reflection and argument, and letter writing and counsel. The immediate problem was simpler and more disorienting. They had witnessed something that had no category in their existing world, and they had to figure out what to do with it. The resurrection appearances continued for 40 days, according to Luke's account in the opening of Acts. Jesus appeared to individuals and to groups. Paul, writing to the Corinthians roughly 20 years after the events, provides what scholars recognize as one of the earliest preserved summaries of resurrection testimony. A list of named witnesses that reads less like theological proclamation and more like a legal brief. He appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time, Paul notes, most of whom are still alive, an aside that functions as a direct invitation to verify the account. Then to James, then to all the apostles, then to Paul himself, on a road outside Damascus, in an encounter that turned the most dangerous enemy of the early movement into its most tireless advocate. 500 witnesses, still alive. Go ask them. This is not the language of mythology. Mythology does not invite verification. Mythology does not anchor itself in the names of living people who can be questioned. What Paul was doing in that letter written to a community in a major Roman city with easy access to travelers from Judea, was making a claim that he believed could withstand scrutiny, because the people who had seen what he was describing were still alive and still saying what they had said from the beginning. The early community that formed around this testimony was not, in its first years, a separate religion. It was a movement within Judaism, centered in Jerusalem, gathering daily in the temple courts and in private homes, sharing meals, holding resources in common, and proclaiming in every available public space that the man who had been crucified under Pontius Pilate had been raised from the dead by the God of Israel, and was therefore something more than a prophet, more than a teacher, more than a failed revolutionary. The proclamation was specific about the crucifixion. This is important. There was no softening of the method of execution in the early preaching, no attempt to substitute a more dignified death for the historical one. Peter's sermon at Pentecost names it directly. You crucified him. The cross was not minimized or explained away. It was central. Because the resurrection did not erase the crucifixion, it reinterpreted it. The same Roman machinery of death that had been designed to produce maximum shame and maximum finality had become, in the space of 3 days, the pivot point of a completely different story. This reinterpretation moved against every cultural instinct of the ancient world. In Roman society, crucifixion victims were non-persons. Their deaths were meant to be forgotten. The cross communicated. This person had no power, no allies, no future, no legacy. To proclaim a crucified man as Lord in a Roman city was not merely offensive. It was socially unintelligible. A lord was someone who had power. Power was demonstrated through victory, through armies, through the ability to compel and to protect. A man who had been stripped naked and nailed to wood on a public road had demonstrated the opposite of power, by every available measure of the ancient world. And yet, the movement grew, not because it was socially advantageous. In the first generations, it was frequently dangerous, not because it promised material prosperity. The earliest communities were marked by voluntary poverty and radical generosity toward the poor, not because it had the support of the powerful. The same temple authorities who had arranged the crucifixion continued to resist the movement, and Rome would eventually add its own systematic violence to the opposition. It grew because the witnesses would not stop saying what they had seen. Paul's letter to the Philippians, written from prison, contains a passage that has been read in Christian communities for 2,000 years. A poem or hymn that theologians believe may be even older than the letter itself. Possibly one of the earliest fragments of Christian worship ever preserved. It describes a movement downward, from the highest possible status to the lowest possible death, followed by a movement upward that reverses every human assumption about how power and honor and vindication work. The cross is not an interruption of the story. It is the mechanism of the story. But to understand why that reinterpretation was not merely philosophical, but concretely transformative, you have to go back to the locked room in Jerusalem and feel the specific weight of what those disciples were carrying when the doors they had barred against the world suddenly became irrelevant. They had watched their teacher die in the manner reserved for slaves and rebels. They had spent the Sabbath in silence and fear, behind locked doors, in a city that had moved on. They had gone to a sealed tomb and found it open. They had heard testimony from women whose legal standing as witnesses in their society was considered insufficient for formal proceedings. They had encountered him on a road without recognizing him, and recognized him in a gesture. They had seen him eat a piece of fish in a locked room. And then, 40 days after the resurrection, according to Luke, he led them out toward Bethany, a village on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, familiar to all of them as the place where Lazarus had lived, where Jesus had wept before a tomb and then called a dead man out of it. And there, in the open air of the hillside, he was taken from their sight. The disciples returned to Jerusalem, Luke says, with great joy. Not with grief, not with confusion, with great joy. This is the detail that marks the actual transformation. These were the same people who had been paralyzed behind locked doors 3 days after the crucifixion. Fear had been the governing reality of their lives in the immediate aftermath of the cross. And now, after 40 days of encounters they could not explain and would not stop describing, they returned to the city that had killed their teacher, not hiding, not fleeing, but returning openly, with joy, to wait for what he had told them would come next. Something had reorganized them at a level deeper than strategy, or morale, or collective decision. Something had made the locked doors unnecessary. The 3 days that changed everything did not change the political situation in Judea. Rome remained. The temple authorities remained. The social order that made crucifixion a tool of control remained intact. The world looked, from the outside, exactly as it had looked before. Poverty was still poverty. Occupation was still occupation. Death was still death. In every garden and every household, and every stone-carved tomb in the hillsides around Jerusalem. But in a small community of people who had watched a man die and then encountered him alive, something fundamental had shifted in the understanding of what death actually was, what it could do, and more precisely, what it could not do. The cross had not been the end of the story. The stone had been rolled away. The grave cloths had been folded. And a woman had heard her name spoken in a garden at dawn, by a voice she recognized, and everything after that was different. Not because the world became easier, not because the suffering stopped, or the empire relented, or the questions disappeared, but because the resurrection had introduced into human history a category that had not existed before that Sunday morning. The possibility that the worst thing is not the final thing. That is what those 3 days carried. That is what moved out of Jerusalem on foot, in the breath of witnesses, along Roman roads and across Mediterranean waters, into cities and villages and households across the known world. Not a philosophy, not a political program, not a religious institution, but a testimony. We saw him die. We saw the tomb sealed. And then the stone was moved, and he was not there. And then he was standing among us, saying our names, eating fish by the fire, showing us his hands. History has never been able to fully account for what happened in those 3 days. It has produced alternative explanations, each requiring its own set of improbabilities, each running against the simplest reading of the evidence, each struggling to explain not only the empty tomb, but the transformation of the witnesses, the locked doors thrown open, the fear replaced by joy, the scattered disciples reconstituted into a community that turned the ancient world upside down. Jesus was not remembered the way teachers are remembered, in texts studied at a distance, in ideas discussed in schools. He was proclaimed as present, living, known not in the past tense, but in the continuous tense of encounter. And the community that formed around that proclamation carried within it, from its first days, the stubborn conviction that the 3 days had not been an interruption of the story. They had been the story.